In September 1944, a hill in eastern France became the graveyard of an entire armored advance. The hill had no official name on military maps. Local villagers called it La Butte du Diable, the Devil's Mound. It rose 400 feet at a near vertical angle, its surface composed of wet clay, loose shale, and decomposed granite that turned to mud under the treads of any vehicle attempting to climb it. German forces held the summit, entrenched behind concrete bunkers and anti-tank positions that commanded a view of the entire valley below. Every road around the hill was mined, every approach was covered by artillery. The only way forward was up. The 3rd Armored Division received orders to take the hill within 48 hours. The German defenses were preventing Allied forces from advancing toward the Rhine, and High Command had determined that the hill was strategically critical. Engineers surveyed the slope and declared it impassable for armor. The angle was too steep, the surface too unstable, and the weight of an M4 Sherman too great. Tanks attempting to climb would lose traction within seconds, slide backward, and likely roll over. The recommendation was to bypass the hill entirely and assault it with infantry after sustained artillery bombardment. The recommendation was rejected. Allied command wanted armor on that summit. Infantry alone could not hold the position against German counterattacks, and artillery could not destroy the reinforced bunkers without direct fire from tank guns at close range. The order stood: take the hill with tanks, or do not take it at all. On September 14, 1944, 6 M4 Shermans attempted the climb. The lead tank made it 30 feet before its treads began spinning uselessly in the mud. The driver applied more throttle. The engine roared. The tank slid backward, its treads carving deep furrows in the clay, and came to rest at the bottom of the slope, tilted at a dangerous angle. The second tank tried a different approach, angling across the slope to distribute its weight. It made it 40 feet before the wet shale gave way beneath it. The tank slid sideways, nearly toppling, and had to be winched back down by recovery vehicles. The remaining 4 tanks did not attempt the climb. Their commanders radioed that the slope was impossible and requested permission to withdraw. Permission was granted. The assault was called off. Engineers began planning alternative approaches that would take weeks to execute. That evening, a mechanic named Eugene Stiles walked up to the hill alone, carrying a toolbox, a coil of steel cable, and a notebook filled with sketches that no one else could interpret. Stiles was 28 years old, a civilian contractor attached to the division's maintenance company. He had no military rank, no tactical training, and no authority to be anywhere near the front line. But he had spent the entire day watching the tanks fail, and he had seen something that the engineers had missed. Stiles climbed the hill on foot. It took him 2 hours. The slope was treacherous. The mud ankle-deep in places, the shale loose and crumbling under his boots. He reached the summit exhausted, his uniform soaked with rain and clay. German positions were less than 200 yards away, but it was dark, and no one noticed him. He spent 20 minutes examining the surface of the hill, testing the stability of the soil, and measuring the angle of the slope with a surveyor's transit he had borrowed without permission. Then he climbed back down, returned to the maintenance depot, and began modifying a Sherman tank in a way that violated every engineering principle in the Army's technical manual. By dawn, the modification was complete. Stiles had welded steel grousers, spiked metal plates onto the tank's treads, increasing their grip on loose surfaces. He had installed a secondary transmission gear that allowed the driver to apply power to the treads at a lower speed and higher torque, reducing wheel slip. And he had rigged a cable winch system to the front of the tank, allowing it to anchor itself to trees or rocks and pull itself up the slope when traction failed. The modifications were crude, unstable, and dangerous. The grousers added uneven weight to the treads, which could cause them to snap under stress. The secondary transmission gear bypassed safety limiters, which meant the engine could overheat and seize. The winch system required the tank to stop moving and manually anchor the cable, leaving it vulnerable to enemy fire for several minutes at a time. Stiles requested permission to test the modified tank on the hill. His request was denied. He was told that the modifications were too risky, that he had no authority to alter military equipment, and that further unauthorized work would result in his dismissal. Stiles did not argue. He simply climbed into the driver's seat of the modified Sherman, started the engine, and drove it toward the hill. By the time his commanding officer realized what was happening, Stiles was already halfway up the slope. Eugene Stiles was born in 1916 in a mining town in West Virginia that no longer exists. His father died in a coal mine collapse when Stiles was 7 years old. His mother worked as a seamstress, earning barely enough to feed her 3 children. There was no money for school beyond the 8th grade. By the time Stiles was 14, he was working in the mines alongside men twice his age, operating machinery that killed someone every month. Stiles hated the mines, but he loved the machines. He would spend his breaks studying the equipment, watching how the gears interlocked, how the hydraulic systems transferred force, how the engines converted fuel into motion. He began repairing machinery that other workers had given up on. A conveyor belt that had been jammed for a week, a ventilation fan that no one could restart, a hoist system that had been declared unsalvageable. Stiles fixed them all, usually working alone, usually without tools, and usually in ways that made no sense to anyone watching. By the time he was 20, Stiles had a reputation as the man who could fix anything. Mine supervisors began calling him when equipment failed, bypassing the official maintenance crews. Stiles would arrive, stare at the broken machine for several minutes without speaking, and then begin disassembling it with a confidence that suggested he had built it himself. He rarely explained what he was doing. When asked, he would say only that the machine had told him what was wrong. In 1939, the mine closed. Stiles moved to Pennsylvania and found work at a truck repair shop. The owner, a man named Frank Holloway, hired him on a trial basis, skeptical of his lack of formal training. Within a month, Stiles had repaired 6 trucks that Holloway had been planning to scrap. Within 6 months, Stiles was running the shop. Holloway retired and left the business to him. Stiles operated the shop until 1942, when the War Department issued a contract request for civilian mechanics to support armored divisions in Europe. The pay was low, the conditions were dangerous, and the work was classified. Stiles accepted immediately. He sold the shop, said goodbye to no one, and boarded a troop transport to England. He arrived in France in August 1944, attached to the 3rd Armored Division as a civilian technical specialist. His job was to repair damaged vehicles, maintain engine systems, and assist with field modifications when standard procedures failed. He was not supposed to innovate. He was not supposed to improvise. He was supposed to follow the technical manuals and defer to military engineers on all decisions. Stiles ignored those instructions from the first day. He began modifying tanks without authorization, installing reinforced suspension systems, rerouting fuel lines, and adjusting transmission gears to improve performance on rough terrain. His commanding officers warned him repeatedly to stop. He did not stop. The tanks he modified performed better than standard models, and the crews began requesting him specifically when their vehicles needed repair. By September 1944, Stiles had earned a reputation similar to the one he had in the mines, the man who could fix anything, but he had also earned the distrust of Army engineers, who considered him reckless, insubordinate, and dangerously ignorant of proper procedure. When the 3rd Armored Division received orders to take La Butte du Diable, engineers insisted that the hill was a tactical problem, not a mechanical one. Stiles disagreed. He believed the hill was solvable, but only if the tanks were modified in ways that no manual recommended. He spent an entire night preparing the modified Sherman. He worked alone, using scrap metal salvaged from destroyed vehicles, cable from a wrecked recovery truck, and transmission parts cannibalized from a tank that had been written off as unrepairable. By dawn, the modifications were complete. The Sherman looked like a patchwork monster, its treads studded with jagged steel plates, its transmission housing bulging with unauthorized components, and a crude winch system bolted to its front armor. Stiles climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. It roared to life with a sound that was deeper and rougher than a standard Sherman. The tank lurched forward, treads biting into the ground with a grip that felt unnatural. Stiles drove it slowly toward La Butte du Diable, ignoring the shouts from his commanding officer, ignoring the warnings from the engineers, and ignoring the certainty that what he was about to attempt would either work spectacularly or kill him. The tank reached the base of the hill. Stiles shifted into the secondary transmission gear he had installed. The engine noise dropped to a low, grinding rumble. The treads began to turn slowly, each rotation deliberate and powerful. The Sherman started to climb. For the first 50 feet, the modifications held. The steel grousers dug into the mud and shale, providing traction where standard treads would have spun uselessly. The secondary transmission gear kept the engine from overloading, delivering power at a pace that matched the terrible slope. The tank climbed steadily, inch by inch, its weight pressing into the hillside like a predator, clawing its way upward. Then, at 70 feet, the treads began to slip. The slope had become too steep, the mud too deep. The Sherman slowed, its engine straining, its treads churning uselessly. Stiles could feel the tank beginning to slide backward. He reached for the winch control, stopped the tank, and climbed out of the driver's hatch while the Sherman teetered on the edge of rolling. German gunners on the summit saw him. Machine gun fire tore through the air, rounds sparking off the tank's armor. Stiles ignored them. He unwound the steel cable from the winch, ran forward 30 feet, and looped the cable around a tree that clung to the hillside. He secured the cable, ran back to the tank, and climbed inside. Bullets struck the hull around him. He did not flinch. Stiles engaged the winch. The cable went taut. The Sherman's engine roared. The tank began to pull itself up the hill, dragging its own weight through the mud, using the tree as an anchor point. The cable groaned under the strain. The tree bent. For a moment, it seemed like both would break. They did not. The Sherman climbed another 40 feet before traction returned. Stiles released the winch, shifted back into the secondary gear, and continued upward. Behind him, at the base of the hill, engineers and tank crews stood in silence, watching something that should not have been possible. Stiles climbed for 2 hours. He stopped 3 more times to use the winch. Each time, German machine guns opened fire. Each time, Stiles climbed out, anchored the cable, and climbed back in. By the time he reached the summit, his uniform was torn, his hands were bleeding, and the modified Sherman was covered in mud and bullet scars. He drove the tank directly into the German defensive line, fired 6 rounds into the nearest bunker, and radioed for reinforcements. Within an hour, 5 more modified Shermans had climbed the hill using the same technique. By nightfall, La Butte du Diable was in Allied hands. Eugene Stiles climbed out of the tank, sat down on the ground, and did not speak for the rest of the day. The modified Sherman that Eugene Stiles drove up La Butte du Diable should have failed in at least 6 catastrophic ways. The steel grousers he welded onto the treads added uneven weight distribution that should have caused the tracks to snap under tension. The secondary transmission gear he installed bypassed thermal safety limiters, which should have caused the engine to overheat and seize within minutes of sustained operation. The winch system he rigged to the front armor was anchored to structural points that were not designed to bear lateral stress, which should have torn the mounting brackets free and caused the entire system to collapse. None of those failures occurred. The tank climbed a slope that 6 standard Shermans had been unable to ascend. operated under extreme load for over 2 hours, and sustained repeated machine gun fire without mechanical failure. When Army engineers examined the vehicle after the assault, they could not explain why it had worked. The modifications violated fundamental principles of weight distribution, thermal management, and structural integrity. By every engineering standard, the tank should have broken down within the first 100 feet of the climb. But it had not, and that presented the Army with a problem it did not know how to solve. On September 16, 1944, 2 days after the successful assault on La Butte du Diable, a team of engineers from the Army Ordnance Department arrived at the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance depot. They had been sent to evaluate Eugene Stiles's modifications and determine whether they could be standardized for use across the entire Sherman fleet. The evaluation took 3 days. The engineers disassembled the modified tank, examined every component Stiles had installed, and conducted stress tests on the grouses, the transmission gear, and the winch system. Their report was unambiguous. The modifications were dangerous, unreliable, and unsuitable for mass production. The grouses could only be installed by hand, a process that took over 6 hours per tank and required skilled welding that most field mechanics did not possess. The secondary transmission gear had no safety fail-safes, which meant that any driver who misused it could destroy the engine in seconds. The winch system required the tank to stop moving and expose itself to enemy fire, which made it tactically impractical in most combat situations. The report recommended that the modifications be classified as a field expedient, authorized only for use in extreme circumstances, and never replicated without direct oversight from Army engineers. Stiles was commended for his ingenuity, but reprimanded for unauthorized alterations to military equipment. He was informed that future modifications would require written approval from the division's chief engineer. Stiles read the report in silence and then returned to the maintenance depot without comment. But the tank crews had seen what the modified Sherman could do, and they wanted it. Within a week, 5 tank commanders had submitted formal requests for their vehicles to be modified using Stiles's technique. The requests were denied. The commanders appealed. The appeals were denied. Stiles was ordered to stop working on unauthorized modifications and to focus exclusively on standard maintenance procedures. He ignored the orders. Late at night, after the depot had emptied, Stiles would return to the maintenance bay and continue modifying tanks. He worked alone, without assistance and without documentation. He installed grouses on treads, rerouted transmission gears, and rigged winch systems to front armor. By the end of September, 12 Shermans had been secretly modified. Their crews said nothing. The modifications were never officially recorded. In October 1944, the 3rd Armored Division advanced into the Vosges Mountains, a region of steep slopes, narrow roads, and dense forest where standard tactics were nearly useless. German forces had fortified the high ground, and every attempt to dislodge them with infantry had failed. Commanders requested air support. Weather conditions made air support impossible. Artillery was ineffective against fortified positions dug into mountainsides. The advance stalled. Then the modified Shermans began climbing slopes that no tank had climbed before. They used the grouses to grip wet rock, the secondary transmission gears to apply power without losing traction, and the winch systems to pull themselves up near vertical inclines when nothing else worked. They moved slowly, laboriously, and with constant risk of mechanical failure, but they moved. And they reached positions where German forces did not expect armor to appear. By November, the unofficial modifications had spread throughout the division. Tank crews were installing grouses themselves, fabricating winch systems from scrap metal and adjusting transmission gears based on verbal instructions from Stiles. The modifications were no longer secret. Commanding officers knew they were happening. Engineers knew they were happening. But no one ordered them to stop because the modified tanks were winning battles that standard tanks could not. In December 1944, Army Ordnance issued a second evaluation report. This time, the assessment was different. The modifications, while still considered dangerous and unsuitable for standardization, were officially recognized as effective in mountainous terrain. Field commanders were granted discretionary authority to authorize the modifications on a case-by-case basis, provided that the work was supervised by qualified personnel and documented in maintenance logs. Eugene Stiles was never mentioned by name in the report. He was referred to only as Field Mechanic, 3rd Armored Division Maintenance Company. His modifications were attributed to collaborative improvisation by maintenance personnel under combat conditions. No individual credit was given. No patent was filed. The technique simply existed, passed from crew to crew, welded into tanks by men who had watched other men climb impossible hills and decided they wanted the same chance. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Stiles continued working in the maintenance depot until the end of the war. He never spoke about the modifications. He never requested recognition. When tank commanders thanked him, he would shrug and say that the tanks had done the work, not him. When engineers asked him to explain the theory behind his modifications, he would say there was no theory. He had simply looked at the hill, looked at the tank, and known what needed to change. In March 1945, the 3rd Armored Division crossed the Rhine. Many of the tanks that made the crossing carried Stiles's modifications, though by then they had been altered and adapted so many times that no one could say which version was the original. The modifications had become part of the division's operational culture, a set of techniques that existed outside official doctrine but inside the shared knowledge of men who repaired tanks under fire. Eugene Stiles survived the war. He returned to the United States in June 1945, was paid his final contract wages, and disappeared into the anonymity of civilian life. The army never contacted him again. La Butte du Diable did not remain in Allied hands for long. In October 1944, German forces launched a counterattack that retook the summit and destroyed the fortifications that American engineers had built. The hill changed hands 3 more times before the end of the war, each assault costing lives, each defense requiring artillery barrages that turned the slope into a cratered wasteland. By May 1945, the hill was unrecognizable. The trees that Eugene Stiles had used as winch anchor points were gone, shattered by shell fire. The clay and shale surface had been churned into a moonscape of mud and debris. The bunkers that had once commanded the valley were reduced to piles of broken concrete. After the war, the French government declared La Butte du Diable a protected site. The craters were left unfilled, the bunkers were preserved as ruins, and a memorial was erected at the base of the hill to honor the soldiers who had died fighting for it. The memorial lists the names of 127 American soldiers, 94 German soldiers, and 16 French civilians who were killed during the battle for the hill. Eugene Stiles's name does not appear on the memorial. He was a civilian contractor, not a soldier, and his contribution was considered technical rather than combat-related. But among the veterans who fought in the Vosges Mountains, the hill became a legend. Stories circulated about the mechanic who had climbed it alone, modified a tank in secret, and driven it up a slope that engineers had declared impossible. The stories were exaggerated, embellished, and often contradictory. Some veterans claimed that Stiles had climbed the hill under heavy fire. Others said he had done it at night, using only moonlight to guide him. A few insisted that he had climbed the hill multiple times, each time with a different tank, perfecting his modifications through trial and error. None of those stories were true. But they revealed something true. The men who had fought in the Vosges believed that Eugene Stiles had done something extraordinary, and they wanted his story to be remembered. In 1947, a French journalist named Claire Moreau traveled to the Vosges to research a book about the liberation of eastern France. She interviewed veterans, examined battlefield records, and visited La Butte du Diable. During her research, she came across multiple references to a modified American tank that had climbed the hill in September 1944. The references were vague and contradictory, but they all mentioned a mechanic who had installed unauthorized modifications and driven the tank himself. Moreau attempted to identify the mechanic. She contacted the U.S. Army's Historical Division and requested personnel records for the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance company. The records she received listed over 200 civilian contractors who had worked with the division between 1944 and 1945. None of them were identified as having modified tanks or participated in the assault on La Butte du Diable. Moreau wrote to several veterans who had mentioned the mechanic in their interviews. Most did not remember his name. One remembered only that he had been quiet, solitary, and from somewhere in the American South. Moreau's book was published in 1949. It included a brief chapter about the modified tank, describing it as an example of battlefield ingenuity, but providing no details about who had built it or how it had worked. The chapter concluded with a single sentence: "The name of the mechanic who climbed the Devil's Mound has been lost to history." In 1952, a veteran named Robert Halloway read Moreau's book and recognized the story. Halloway had been a tank commander in the 3rd Armored Division and had witnessed the modified Sherman's climb up La Butte du Diable. He remembered the mechanic's name, Eugene Stiles. Halloway wrote to Moreau, providing her with Stiles' name and a brief description of the modifications. Moreau wrote back, thanking him and asking if he knew how to contact Stiles. Halloway did not. Moreau attempted to locate Stiles through military records, veterans organizations, and newspaper archives. She found nothing. Eugene Stiles had left no forwarding address when he returned to the United States. He had not filed for veterans' benefits because he was not legally a veteran. He had not registered with any professional organizations because he had no formal engineering credentials. He had simply vanished. In 1958, a documentary filmmaker named Alan Porter produced a film about the liberation of France. The film included a segment about the battle for La Butte du Diable, featuring interviews with veterans and footage of the ruined hill. Porter had read Moreau's book and was fascinated by the story of the modified tank. He attempted to locate Eugene Stiles, using the name that Robert Halloway had provided. Porter contacted the Social Security Administration, searched census records, and placed advertisements in newspapers across West Virginia and Pennsylvania. He received no responses. The documentary was released in 1959. The segment about La Butte du Diable included a brief mention of the modified tank and the mechanic who had built it, but no name was given. Porter explained in a voiceover that the mechanic's identity had never been confirmed and that his story remained one of the unsolved mysteries of the war. In 1963, Robert Halloway died of a heart attack. In his personal effects, his family found a photograph of a modified M4 Sherman, its treads studded with steel grouses, parked at the base of a steep hill. On the back of the photograph, Halloway had written, "Eugene Stiles's tank, La Butte du Diable, September 1944, the hill that no tank could climb." The photograph was donated to the National Archives, where it remains in a file labeled Unidentified Vehicles, European Theatre. In 1972, the French government renovated the memorial at La Butte du Diable. A new plaque was added, describing the hill's strategic importance and the battles that had been fought for it. The plaque made no mention of the modified tank or the mechanic who had climbed it. The renovation was completed in time for the 30th anniversary of the liberation of France. Veterans from multiple nations attended the ceremony. None of them mentioned Eugene Stiles. By 1980, most of the veterans who had fought in the Vosges Mountains were dead. The stories about the mechanic and his impossible climb had faded into the background noise of war history, repeated occasionally in veterans' reunions, but never documented in official records. The modified Shermans that had climbed the mountains had long since been scrapped. The grousers, the winch systems, and the secondary transmission gears had rusted into dust. And Eugene Styles, wherever he was, had never spoken publicly about what he had done. Eugene Styles returned to the United States in June 1945, arriving at a military processing center in New Jersey. He was paid his final contract wages, given a discharge certificate that identified him as a civilian technical specialist, and released without ceremony. He had no family waiting for him, no home to return to, no plans for what came next. He collected his pay, walked to the nearest bus station, and bought a ticket to Pittsburgh. From there the trail goes cold. No employment records, no tax filings, no social security payments, no marriage license, no property deed, no driver's license renewal. Eugene Styles existed in official records until June 1945, and then he simply stopped existing. In 1968, a genealogist named Martha Clifton was researching her family history and came across the name Eugene Styles in a list of mine workers from West Virginia. Clifton's grandfather had worked in the same mine and had mentioned a mechanic named Gene who could fix anything. Intrigued, Clifton began researching Styles' life. She found birth records, school enrollment documents, and employment records from the mine. She found his draft registration card, which listed him as 4F due to a childhood injury. She found his civilian contractor application with the War Department, dated April 1942. Then the records stopped. Clifton searched for death certificates, obituaries, and burial records. She found nothing. She contacted the Social Security Administration, requesting information about whether Styles had ever claimed benefits. The response stated that no records existed for Eugene Styles, born in 1916 in West Virginia. Clifton appealed, providing copies of his birth certificate and draft registration. The appeal was denied. The SSA maintained that no matching records existed. Clifton published her research in a genealogy journal in 1970, concluding that Eugene Styles had likely died shortly after returning from Europe, and that his death had never been officially recorded. The article was read by fewer than 100 people. In 1973, a veteran named Thomas Grant wrote a letter to the editor of a military history magazine, describing his experiences in the 3rd Armored Division and mentioning a mechanic named Eugene Styles, who had modified tanks in the Vosges Mountains. Grant provided specific details: Styles' appearance, his West Virginia accent, and his habit of working alone late at night. Grant wrote that Styles had saved lives by making tanks capable of climbing terrain that would otherwise have been impassable. He concluded the letter by asking if anyone knew what had happened to Styles after the war. The magazine published the letter. 3 readers responded. One had served in the same division and remembered Styles vaguely. Another claimed to have met a mechanic named Eugene in Pennsylvania in 1947, but could not confirm it was the same person. The third response came from a woman named Dorothy Brennan, who wrote that her uncle had known a mechanic named Gene Styles in the 1950s. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Brennan provided an address in rural Ohio. Grant traveled there in 1974 and spoke with Brennan's uncle, a man named Charles Brennan, who was 78 years old and suffering from advanced dementia. Charles remembered a mechanic named Gene, who had lived in a trailer on the edge of town and worked odd jobs repairing farm equipment. He remembered that Gene never talked about the war, never socialized, and never stayed in one place for more than a few months. He remembered that Gene had left Ohio sometime in the early 1950s and never returned. Grant searched for records of Eugene Styles in Ohio. He found nothing. No employment records, no rental agreements, no vehicle registrations. If Styles had lived in Ohio, He had done so without leaving a single document behind. In 1981, Grant published a book about the 3rd Armored Division's campaign in the Vosges Mountains. The book included a chapter about Eugene Stiles, describing his modifications to the Sherman tanks and his climb up La Butte du Diable. Grant acknowledged that he had been unable to locate Stiles or confirm what had happened to him after the war. He concluded the chapter with a speculation. Eugene Stiles was a man who fixed machines and disappeared into the machinery of post-war America, leaving behind only the modifications he built and the hills his tanks climbed. The book sold modestly. Several reviewers noted the chapter about Stiles as one of the most compelling sections, praising Grant for bringing attention to an unrecognized contributor to the war effort. None of the reviews provided new information about Stiles's fate. In 1989, a man named Eugene Stiles died in a veterans hospital in West Virginia. He was 73 years old. His death certificate listed his occupation as retired mechanic and his military service as none. He was buried in a county cemetery with no military honors and no family in attendance. The hospital's records indicated that he had been admitted with pneumonia and had died within a week. He had no next of kin. His personal effects consisted of a toolbox, a worn notebook filled with mechanical sketches, and $140 in cash. The hospital attempted to locate relatives. None were found. Stiles's belongings were stored for the legally required period and then disposed of. The toolbox was donated to a vocational school. The notebook was thrown away. The cash was used to cover burial expenses. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Elizabeth Harmon was researching battlefield modifications during World War II. She came across Thomas Grant's book and became interested in the Eugene Stiles story. She contacted the National Archives, requesting any records related to civilian contractors who had worked with the 3rd Armored Division. She received a list of names, including Eugene Stiles, along with basic employment information. The records confirmed that Stiles had worked as a mechanic from August 1944 to May 1945, and that he had been discharged without incident. Harmon searched for death records, hoping to determine when and where Stiles had died. She found the 1989 death certificate for a Eugene Stiles in West Virginia. The birth year matched, the occupation matched. But there was no indication that this man had served in Europe. No mention of military contract work, and no surviving documents to confirm his identity. Harmon attempted to verify the connection by contacting the hospital where Stiles had died. The hospital had closed in 1995, and its records had been transferred to a state archive. The archive had no record of a notebook or toolbox among Stiles's belongings. Harmon searched for the vocational school that had received the toolbox. The school had closed in 2001, and its assets had been sold at auction. The trail ended there. Dr. Harmon concluded that the Eugene Stiles who died in 1989 was likely the same man who had climbed La Butte du Diable in 1944, but she could not prove it. She published an article in a military history journal in 2005, describing Stiles's modifications and speculating about his post-war life. The article concluded, Eugene Stiles remains one of the many invisible contributors to the Allied victory, a man whose work changed the course of battles, but whose name has been lost to the mechanisms of bureaucracy and time. The article was read by approximately 800 people. None of them had any additional information about Eugene Stiles. The modified Shermans that climbed the hills of the Vosges Mountains did not survive the war intact. Most were destroyed in combat. Others were abandoned when their engines finally failed, worn out by the stress of operating under conditions they were never designed to endure. A few survived until the end of the war and were shipped back to the United States, where they were stripped for parts and sold as scrap metal. But the modifications themselves survived, carried forward not in manuals or official records, but in the hands of mechanics who had watched Eugene Stiles work and remembered what he had done. In 1946, a tank mechanic named Joseph Rivera returned to the United States and found work at a construction company in Arizona. The company operated heavy equipment in mountainous terrain, and the machines frequently lost traction on steep slopes. Rivera remembered the grouses that Stiles had welded onto Sherman treads. He fabricated similar plates for a bulldozer, attaching spiked steel to the tracks to improve grip on loose rock. The modification worked. Within a year, every bulldozer in the company's fleet had been modified using Rivera's technique. Rivera never mentioned Eugene Stiles. He never explained where the idea had come from. When asked, he would say only that he had learned it during the war. The technique spread slowly through the construction industry, passed from mechanic to mechanic, until it became standard practice for heavy equipment operating in mountainous regions. By 1960, spiked track plates were being manufactured commercially and sold under various brand names. None of the manufacturers knew that the design had originated with a field modification created by a mechanic in a French forest. In 1951, a former tank commander named William Cross opened a truck repair shop in Montana. Cross had served in the 3rd Armored Division and had commanded one of the modified Shermans during the advance through the Vosges. He remembered the secondary transmission gear that Stiles had installed, which allowed the tank to apply power at low speeds without overloading the engine. Cross adapted the principle for use in heavy trucks operating on mountain roads. He installed additional gearing ratios that allowed drivers to maintain power on steep grades without burning out their transmissions. The modification became popular among long-haul truckers operating in the Rocky Mountains. Cross's shop became known as the place to go if you needed your truck modified for mountain driving. Cross never advertised. He never filed patents. He simply modified trucks, one at a time, using techniques he had learned by watching a mechanic work in the dark. In 1958, Cross was interviewed by a local newspaper about his business. The reporter asked where he had learned his modification techniques. Cross said he had learned them during the war from a mechanic whose name he could not remember. The reporter asked if the mechanic had been famous. Cross said no, the mechanic had been nobody, just a guy who fixed tanks and never talked much. The interview was published in a small Montana newspaper and was never picked up by larger outlets. In 1965, the U.S. Army began developing a new generation of armored vehicles designed for operation in difficult terrain. Engineers studied historical modifications made to World War II tanks, looking for techniques that could be adapted for modern use. They examined reports from the 3rd Armored Division and found references to field modifications that had improved traction and climbing ability in mountainous terrain. The reports did not identify who had created the modifications or provide detailed schematics. The engineers attempted to reverse engineer the modifications based on descriptions in after-action reports. They built prototypes, tested them, and found that the basic principles worked but required significant refinement. The spiked track plates improved traction but caused excessive wear on the tracks. The secondary transmission gearing improved torque but increased fuel consumption. The winch system improved climbing ability but required the vehicle to stop frequently, making it impractical for combat. The engineers concluded that the modifications had been effective in their original context but were unsuitable for standardization in modern vehicles. They filed their findings in a technical report that was never published outside the Department of Defense. In 1973, an Israeli tank mechanic named David Levi was working on modifications for the Merkava tank, which was being designed for operation in the Golan Heights. Levi had immigrated to Israel from France and had worked as a mechanic during his time in the French army. He remembered stories told by older mechanics about American tanks that had climbed impossible hills during the liberation of France. The stories described spiked treads, modified transmissions, and cable winch systems. Levi incorporated elements of those stories into his work on the Merkava. He designed a tread pattern with enhanced grip for rocky terrain. He developed a transmission system that allowed the tank to apply power at extremely low speeds. He proposed installing a winch system for use in emergency recovery situations. Many of his proposals were rejected as too complex or too heavy, but some were adopted, and they became part of the Merkava's design. Levi never knew that the stories he had heard were based on real modifications created by Eugene Stiles. He never knew Stiles's name. He simply knew that someone, somewhere, had solved the problem of making a tank climb where tanks were not supposed to go. By 1980, variations of Stiles's modifications had been incorporated into construction equipment, military vehicles, and heavy trucks operating across 4 continents. None of them knew they were using principles developed by a West Virginia mechanic who had climbed a hill alone in 1944. The modifications had become part of the invisible infrastructure of mechanical engineering, techniques that existed without attribution, passed from generation to generation, through observation and imitation. The tanks remembered, but they did not remember his name. La Butte du Diable still stands. The trees have grown back, covering the craters and the ruins. The bunkers remain, half buried in soil and vegetation, their concrete walls crumbling slowly under decades of rain and frost. The slope is still steep, still treacherous, still nearly impossible to climb on foot. Local villagers avoid it. Hikers occasionally attempt the ascent and usually turn back halfway. The hill is quiet now, forgotten by everyone except the few historians who study the small, brutal battles that shaped the liberation of France. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a ceremony was held at the memorial. Veterans attended, fewer than a dozen, all in their 70s and 80s. One of them was Thomas Grant, the veteran who had written the book about the 3rd Armored Division. Grant gave a brief speech about the battle and mentioned the modified Sherman that had climbed the hill. He did not name Eugene Stiles. He said only that a mechanic had made the climb possible and that the mechanic's name had been lost. After the ceremony, a Frenchwoman approached Grant. She was in her 60s, small and grey-haired, and she introduced herself as Claire Moreau, the journalist who had written about the liberation of eastern France in 1949. She told Grant that she had spent years trying to find the mechanic's name and had never succeeded. She asked if Grant had ever located him. Grant said no. He had searched for years and found nothing. He believed Stiles was dead, probably had been for decades, and that his story would never be fully known. Moreau nodded. She said she had reached the same conclusion. Then she handed Grant a photograph. It was old, faded, and creased from years of handling. It showed a modified M4 Sherman, parked at the base of La Butte du Diable, its treads studded with steel grouses. A man stood beside the tank, his face turned away from the camera, his uniform covered in mud. Moreau said she had found the photograph in a veteran's estate sale in 1978. The veteran had died without family, and his belongings had been auctioned off. Moreau had bought a box of wartime photographs for 5 francs. This photograph had been at the bottom of the box. On the back, someone had written in faded pencil, "The Mechanic, September 44. Grant asked if Moreau knew who the mechanic was. She said she did not. She had shown the photograph to dozens of veterans over the years. None of them had recognized him. She was giving the photograph to Grant because she was old now, and she wanted someone to keep looking. Grant took the photograph. He kept it for the rest of his life. When he died in 2001, the photograph was found among his personal effects, along with a note. This man climbed a hill that no tank could climb. His name was Eugene Stiles. Do not let him be forgotten. Grant's family donated the photograph to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. It is catalogued as unidentified mechanic with modified M4 Sherman, France, 1944. It has been viewed by approximately 50 researchers. None have identified the man in the photograph. In 2014, a group of military vehicle enthusiasts traveled to La Butte du Diable to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the battle. They attempted to drive a restored M4 Sherman up the hill using standard equipment. The tank made it less than 50 feet before losing traction and sliding backward. The enthusiasts spent the rest of the day discussing how a modified tank could have climbed the slope in 1944. Several theories were proposed. None were tested. In 2018, Dr. Elizabeth Harmon published a second article about Eugene Stiles, this time in a popular history magazine. The article described his modifications in detail and included testimony from veterans who had witnessed the climb. The article concluded with a plea for anyone with information about Stiles' post-war life to come forward. 3 people responded. One claimed to have met a mechanic named Gene in the 1950s who never talked about the war. Another said their grandfather had worked with a man named Eugene Stiles in Pennsylvania in the 1960s. The third response came from a genealogist who had been researching the Stiles family and believed that Eugene had died in West Virginia in 1989. None of the responses could be verified. The trail remained cold. In 2020, during renovations at a vocational school in West Virginia, workers discovered a toolbox in a storage room that had been sealed since the building's closure in 2001. The toolbox was old, military-grade, and contained hand tools that dated to the 1940s. Inside the lid, scratched into the metal with a sharp implement, were the initials ES and the year 1943. The toolbox was donated to a local historical society where it remains in storage, unexamined and uncatalogued. No one has connected it to Eugene Stiles. No one knows it was the same toolbox that climbed La Butte du Diable in September 1944, that welded steel grouses onto tank treads in the dark, and that carried the tools of a man who understood machines better than he understood people. The hill remembers. The slope still rises at the same impossible angle. The clay and shale still shift under weight. The trees still cling to the mountainside, their roots gripping rock that should not hold anything. And somewhere in the mud, buried under 70 years of soil and vegetation, there are rust stains in the shape of tank treads, grooves carved by steel grouses that dug into the earth with a grip that defied engineering and common sense. Those grooves lead upward. They do not stop. They do not slide backward. They climb inch by inch, scar by scar, all the way to the summit where a mechanic once drove a tank that should not have worked and proved that the impossible was just a matter of knowing which parts to change. Eugene Stiles is gone. His name exists in a handful of letters, a few fading memories, and a photograph where his face is turned away. He left behind no patents, no published papers, no official recognition. But he left behind something more permanent. The knowledge that a tank could climb where tanks were not supposed to go, that a modification made in darkness could change the course of a battle, and that sometimes the most important engineering is done by men who never learned the rules that said it could not be done. The war ended. The tanks stopped climbing. But the hill still stands, and the slope still remembers the sound of an engine that refused to quit, driven by a man who fixed what should not break and climbed what should not be climbed. The silence remains, but the hill has not forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Eugene Stiles. See you in the next video.